Welcome to the National Center for Spectator Sports Safety and Security at the University of Southern Mississippi's Online Technology Forum series. Our title today is Navigating Vehicle Threat Mitigation. I am your moderator, Michael Finley. The Technology Forum series is where we review people, processes, and technology by partnering with leading industry technology providers to discuss how their technology applies to the operational community. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few basic platform issues. We will not be using the hand-raising function, but we will be taking questions for our panel. To ask a question for desktop users, use the question function is on the right-hand side of the screen. For mobile phone users, the question function is at the bottom of the screens. We will have a question and answer period at the end of the session where we will pose your questions to the panel, and we will try to get to as many as we can. Now, as I'd like for the panel to introduce themselves, and David, please, we'll start with you.
Sure. Thanks, Michael. Good afternoon. I'm David Walks. I'm president of Concentric Security. I have 16 years in the perimeter physical security space and over 30 years in security in general, to include ballistic attack, blast, and some electronic security as well. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, David. Philip?
I'm Phil Melcher. I'm Director of Security for the Cardinals. I've been here coming up this year will be my 5th season with the Cardinals, and time flies. But I've got about 36 years in security, law enforcement, military, intelligence world. So a bunch of different things throughout my past that kind of got me here, and love doing what I do here with the Cardinals.
And thank you, Phil. I would like you to introduce yourself, and if you will, just go ahead and start us off.
Sure thing. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure for all of us to be here. I'll speak on behalf of my co-panelists here. My name is Akmal Ali, founder and CEO of Illuma. Most of you probably know who we are by now, but Illuma is a risk management security consulting firm that, among other things, specializes in the Safety Act. I formerly served as the deputy director of the Safety Act office in the Department of Homeland Security, so got a long history with the program. And today we appreciate everybody's time. We know there's a lot going on, and for those teams and those organizations that are in part of professional sports teams whose seasons may have ended, doesn't mean your job stops. And we know that you're maybe as busy, if not busier, during the off season. So we appreciate your time. Today we thought we would talk about a topic we think a lot of people are looking at right now, which is, as the title suggests, navigating vehicle threat mitigation, but do it through the lens of the Safety Act. Now, I understand from the top, not everybody's pursuing the Safety Act, but I think what the Safety Act has done over time is establish a set of de facto best practices in certain areas where there may not be very clear direct guidance on how to accomplish X, Y, and Z. And I think the hardened perimeter process is one of those. So I think we'll be talking about it. My co-panelists here, David's got a wealth of information on how to execute the hardened perimeter. Obviously, having Phil here is incredible because he can tell you as someone who's actually done it for his own venue. So we thought it was a good mix between giving everyone kind of background on the program and then actually living through it, what it all means. So we're going to go ahead and jump into the presentation here. Look, I think NCS4 does an incredible job getting the word out on the Safety Act. So I don't think a lot of people are still wondering how, what are the protections and what are the benefits. But I thought it might be interesting and helpful to take a step back and talk about why the Safety Act exists. I don't know how much, we've covered it in the past. I know NCS4 has covered it in the past, but I think it's worth going back and addressing it again. Setting the stage, we go back to the '93 World Trade Center bombing in February of 1993. Everyone recalls what happened in that, the attack occurred. Everyone remembers the smoke billowing out of the parking garage and the horrific pictures that day, but not a lot of people are aware of what happened in the court room afterwards. So, when I used to work at DHS, and still today, we say you can't sue a terrorist. They're either dead, they have no money, or you can't access their money. Yet, because acts of terrorism are, they're designed to have significant impact on life and businesses, people need to recover. And so there's always that big pull and give there that, people need to recover and after an act of terrorism, but who do they recover from? And oftentimes businesses who were there on the day of the attack, who were otherwise victims of the attack themselves, get handed these big, extraordinarily large lawsuits. And in the '93 World Trade Center case, in that case, the Port Authority of New York, New Jersey, the landlord and operators of the World Trade Center building that day, they were assessed 68% of the liability, and the terrorists 32% of the liability, which is a pretty jaw-dropping decision. You don't need to be a lawyer or in risk management or any of that or insurance to kind of do the math and go, how could the venue operator who was a victim of the attack be held more liable than the actual terrorist? And I mean, the point there is people need to recover, and the system not being perfect can't recover from the perpetrators of the attack themselves. So, you know, the business gets handed the bill, so to speak. And, you know, what I think that set in motion was this fear in the industry, rightfully so, that operators of large venues say, hey, look, you know, and in that case, it turned out that the Port Authority had run a risk assessment a couple of years before the attack. And the risk assessment had concluded that the public parking garage was a vulnerability. Now, that's fine, but the recommendations was you either close it completely to the public or put in millions of dollars of screening equipment. And the Port Authority, just like every one of you out there, you know, had to run a cost-benefit analysis. They had to do the best they could with the limited dollars they have. And sometimes that means you can't do everything. So the court hangs their hat on the fact that a risk assessment occurred, the Port Authority should have known, et cetera, et cetera. Well, what's the net outcome of that? You get a lot of venue operators who say, you know what, I'm not going to run my risk assessment. The Port Authority ran its risk assessment to be a good steward of a public venue. They didn't have to do that. But because they did, now they have this information. So what are you going to do about it? And so it's a really tough position to be in. A lot of venue operators said, I don't know if I want to run a risk assessment because I might learn something like that as well. Bad public policy. The government wants to put industry in a position to feel safe and confident about making these, because just like you, the Port Authority wants to do right. They want to protect the people that come into their properties. Fast forward to 9/11, must talk about this case with the utmost sensitivity that it deserves. One of the worst days in U.S. history, but from a legal standpoint, we saw a lot of the same things. Can't sue a terrorist. They're either dead, they have no money, or you can't access their money. But people need to recover. So, you know, big businesses were hit with multi-billion-dollar lawsuits, and so the same type of thing. You know, one example being Boeing was hit with a multi-billion-dollar lawsuit. Allegation being had the flight deck doors been more secure, the terrorists would not have been able to breach, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Even though, and again, with the utmost sensitivity, a couple hours before the attack, those doors are FAA compliant. Those are industry leading. It's just them and Airbus leading the marketplace. So, you know, it's really hard to convince people after the incidents occurred that what you were doing was enough. So entered the Safety Act. Industry comes to Congress pleading, hey, look, if you want us to keep engaged in this fight against terrorism, you got to protect us. We need to have something in place that says, okay, you know, you did the right thing. You're putting your very limited dollars towards protecting the public. You know, how can we protect and motivate businesses? So Congress responded. And in the Homeland Security Act of 2002, they created the Safety Act. Homeland Security Act of 2002 is the law that stood up DHS. That's the thing that brought 22 disparate agencies together and created the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. And in that bill is the Safety Act. So my point is that it's written into law by Congress and it's been there since day one. I won't spend too much time talking about the different levels of coverage. I think everybody in the NCS4 community has a good understanding of how it all works. The point is you demonstrate that you have something effective to combat terrorism, and you don't necessarily have to just stop it. It's even mitigating acts of terrorism. If you're doing that and you can demonstrate that DHS, the Department of Homeland Security will extend itself and provide very powerful third-party liability protections. But the protections are so grand that you would imagine that DHS has a very thorough process. I call it rigorous but fair. These liability protections, and as someone who used to work in DHS, I know what it feels like to, you know, make a recommendation to approve a venue. You get a little sweat beat in the back of your neck because, holy cow, that's a big decision to give someone liability protections. But if someone really approves it and demonstrates they did all the necessary things, then that's how the program is intended to work and written into law by Congress and signed by the president. So, you know, we'll talk about some updates throughout the course of today's presentation. Just one that you may be aware of that I would share with everybody after 13 years of incredible service. The director of the Safety Act Office Bruce Davison has announced his retirement. You know, I was his deputy, so he's got a special place in my heart. And I think one of the reasons why the program has done so much with venue operators is because of his leadership. So that's a big deal, and so that's big news. But the program is going to continue the way it has, and so that's a little bit about the program. You know, I thought you know, I'll pass the baton here over to Phil to talk a little bit about, you know, Phil, from your standpoint, from the St. Louis Cardinals. What motivated you guys to go after the program, and what could you share about that process?
Thanks, Akmal. I would agree that to a very great extent, the liability protections are, a really good incentive to going forth and going after Safety Act, either designation, certification for a venue. But I think it goes to something even bigger and something better and something that you kind of alluded to earlier about facilities doing these kinds of going through these processes of doing assessments and things of that nature, and then trying to get better as a result of it. You have a lot of facilities that have, that are very happy with where they're at, and a lot of facilities that have people in place that have been there a very long time, and they're comfortable and they don't really see the need to do certain things. Unfortunately, in our environment, things change, threats change, technology changes, capabilities of our adversaries change, and intent changes, and so there's so many different variables that really force us to change and get better. So I think, the one of the intended consequences of Safety Act, whether they wrote it in as part of the intent or not, is to get better and to improve. So, it's about being able to demonstrate and having metrics, being able to demonstrate, this is where we were, this is where we are, this is where we're going, and being able to demonstrate that, not just oh yeah, here's what we did and here's where you're gonna be required to demonstrate that on paper. One of the things that I've seen in many organizations is they're going to do these assessments, and or they'll do red team assessments where they're actually testing their own physical security capabilities at their stadium, how their screeners are doing, whether they're stopping individuals bringing in contraband, things of that nature. And you start looking at those processes and you start identifying, you start receiving what most people would consider really bad news. And really bad news in the security business is basically the identification of these vulnerabilities that either you didn't know that were there, or you didn't identify, or you just neglected, and for all intents and purposes. So my thing is not to be afraid of bad news, and my thing is to embrace the bad news and take that bad news, and what are we going to do with that information? I think that's really, really important, because not being afraid of bad news is what our business is all about. You've got to take that bad news and turn it into a positive. So how do you do that? And what are you going to do with that? And what does that motivate you to do? Because the fact now that you know that there's this issue, there's this vulnerability, there's this open gap in your security process or your perimeter or anything within your security rings and concentric rings around your stadium, within your stadium, because you're going to have these different perimeters that you give different people different access to. Not doing something about it when you know about it opens up your liability and makes you less of a candidate for Safety Act recognition. So I think that's really important. So just making sure that you understand that this undertaking is not just, okay, we're going to look at our security policies and we're very simply and just kind of address it. This is an overall organizational impact kind of thing. This is really where everybody's going to be part of this. Now I would always advise any organization that's going to do this, put one person in charge. Have one person within your organization who's going to be the lead person, who's going to kind of take the lead as far as making sure that all the other people are meeting the timelines that you've got set. I think that's really, really important, that when you do that this way, it's not very dispersed. It's not all over the organization. I think that's extremely important. Have somebody who's going to be intimately familiar with the stadium operations, security, or facilities as that point person who's going to know and who can communicate with all of these different people and be kind of that go-to person for relaying information back to DHS, or if you have a consultant with that person, whoever's helping you. The other thing is the management buy-in to this is going to be huge. Getting everybody to be a part of this is huge. You know, I'm more blessed than I can ever explain, because I have, from my C-suite top to bottom, supports what we did, supports what we do, and supports our continuous improvement from a security perspective for Safety Act. And when you see an 82-year-old chairman of the board, CEO of your organization get giddy over Safety Act, that's a big deal. And he doesn't get giddy a whole lot. So he's a wonderful man, but this was something that he really wanted, because it also demonstrates that his stadium is safe, because it's going to keep people coming back and keep people in those seats, because they feel safer, they feel better. Knowing that is huge. That your team's going to be better because you've got more revenue, because you're putting more people in the seats. You know, so everything comes together on this. So nothing happens in a vacuum when you're thinking about this. When you're talking about vehicle barriers, I mean, a lot of that is going to be determined by what's the specific location of your stadium. Where are you at in relation to your city? Are you more rural? Are you more urban? Are you downtown? Are you kind of set aside? Do you have a lot of parking? Do you have outside your facility? Do you have a lot of room in your facility? Or is the main street for your city running right outside your stadium? I mean, these are all different critical things that you're going to have to determine, because I think that's going to be a critical part of determining what it is you're going to be doing from a vehicle barrier and a protective standpoint, from vehicle rammings and vehicles being used as weapons outside your stadium. I think that's really critical, that you really get into that mindset now, that there is no one solution. Outside your stadium, there may be multiple solutions that you're going to have to employ, because almost every single side or different locations of your stadium are going to have different impacts, different traffic patterns, different potential speeds, different potential for different types of vehicles there. You know, so all of these different perpendicular access to your stadium from cross street, all of these things are going to come into play and be really, really critical when it comes to how you're going to start looking at those things. So just keep those things in mind as you start going to the next process. And I'll let Akmal go ahead and start with that.
Thank you, Phil. And it's probably obvious to most folks now, but I think it's worth mentioning that, you know, Phil, you're speaking from experience. The St. Louis Cardinals, for your stadium, you have Safety Act certification. And
Right.
Those who are very familiar with the Safety Act process know that, you know, DHS has gotten a little tougher when it comes to certifications. And so, you know, I was very fortunate to work with the Cardinals and with Phil on that process. And, you know, we went out and got designation first, put some things in place, then achieved certification, and joined a very small group of people who've done that. So Phil, you're speaking from experience, and you know, thank you for sharing those comments. So, you know, what I thought I would do here before I hand it over to David is just talk at a 50,000 foot level. Again, through the lens of the Safety Act, this is what DHS, I think, ultimately wants to hear from you all when you go through this process of achieving a hardened perimeter. But this isn't just for Safety Act. I think this is a process that people should be following anyways. And these are best practices that have lived out there, and I think Safety Act has just maybe helped given a voice to them. But so I thought we would just high level and explain some of these things, because, you know, we all see the words threat assessment all the time, risk assessment. What the heck does that mean? And this lens, they mean specific things. So, you know, high level, one thing as we tell the story, ultimately, you don't have to do everything under the sun. And so before you can tell the story to DHS on how and why you chose the things you did decide to do, you have to tell DHS about your process to come to that conclusion. Step one, understanding your threats. And there's ways of evaluating your threats, a quantitative and a qualitative way of assessing your threats. So, you know, from a vehicle standpoint, we know that, you know, the threats are the obvious ones that you guys can all know about. You don't need to hear from me about those, but just to, you know, going over them, they're the IED, improvised explosive device, vehicle borne IED, vehicle ramming as it relates to the perimeter only. Now, there's all sorts of other threats you're worried about. So From there, though, what are we going to say about those? Well, DHS wants to know that you're actually defining those things. So when we say a vehicle-borne IED, what are we talking about? We want to define the actual charge sizes. What size car bomb are we talking about? What size satchel bomb are we talking about? What type of vehicle? As for a vehicle ramming, you got scores and thousands of pedestrians around your property. You want to keep them safe. What type of vehicle are we worried about that might be some bad actor with malicious intent might be getting behind the wheel? What type of vehicle might that be? What speeds could that vehicle gain? So it's really important to establish your design basis threats, DBTs. Your design basis threats are not just going to say, hey, I'm worried about a vehicle-borne IED. It's going to say, I'm worried about a vehicle-borne IED of this size. Is it 5,000 pounds like Oklahoma City bombing? Is it 2,000 pounds? Is it 500 pounds? It might be a range, and you have to defend why you landed on what you landed on. Just explain the logic. Same thing with the vehicle ramming, okay? What are we looking at? Are we looking at a car driving 5 miles an hour? Are we looking at a car driving 55 miles an hour? And how heavy is that vehicle? Because these things will help inform you in the next stage, which is the vulnerability assessment. As part of the vulnerabilities, again, another very high level term that anyone can ascribe any definition to, but for the purposes of this discussion, the vulnerability assessment is applying those threats, those design basis threats that you define. Let's just say a 2,000 pound VBIED, or a vehicle, a box truck traveling at a 15,000 pound vehicle traveling at 55 miles an hour. Now lay that on top of your venue. How is your venue vulnerable to those types of attack vectors? So two things that come to mind that you'd want to perform, and I know you've all probably heard these terms already, and a lot of you probably have already executed these, but the vehicle vector analyses and the blast analysis. The vehicle vector analysis, using software modeling tools to determine the speeds and angles at which a vehicle can gain access to your building based on the roadway laying around your property, and based on some other assumptions, which Phil will talk about in a moment, making sure that the assumptions that go into that modeling are accurate. What's your event day status like, et cetera. So, the blast analysis, as the name would suggest, is you're using a software modeling tool to take that charge, whether it's a 2,000 pound or 1,000 or 500 pound, and applying it to different parts of your property, and understanding how would the materials of which your building is comprised, how would they interact with that charge? And if you place the charge at different distances, how does it reduce or increase the impact on the building? That's typically performed by a structural engineering firm. There's other folks who may be able to do it, but a lot of you who've been through the process have done that with structural engineering firms who've got the expertise, the know-how, the understanding of these modeling tools. Because guess what? When you go to apply this First Safety Act to DHS will actually rerun some of these numbers on you. They're actually going to look behind the veil a little bit, behind the curtain, and say, okay, use this high power software modeling tool. What were your assumptions? What numbers did you input? And what outputs did you get? I mean, it really gets down that level. Again, think from their standpoint, providing these really critical liability protections, they've just got to make sure that people are doing what they say they're going to do. So the threat assessment informs the vehicle assessment, the vehicle vector analysis, and the blast analysis. And then those give you outcomes. And then you apply those outcomes to the risk assessment. It's basically ranking the outcomes on your operations, as a company. Can you continue business if X happens? What happens to crowds if Y happens? And then you are essentially trying to understand the impact on your operation. And then finally, all of that culminates into a set of recommendations, enhancement recommendations. Like, again, just through the lens of perimeter hardening, structural hardening, protective design. What are some of those enhancements? What are all the recommendations under the sun? But like I said earlier, and I kind of hinted at this in a post about this before this presentation. Spoiler alert, you are not expected by DHS to do every recommendation that comes up. But to Phil's earlier comment, you just at least need to be able to say truthfully, I've availed myself of all the options. I know what they are, but DHS is not going to expect that you have the budget of the Pentagon. And by the way, even the Pentagon does out-year planning for things, right? But the point is, I want to leave you all with the point that DHS does not expect you can do everything under the sun. But they want to know that you went through an evaluative methodology to know what you should do, rank those things, and do a cost-benefit analysis. If there's nothing else, from my section that you'll leave you today with is cost-benefit analysis, a explainable process by which you match up the benefit against the cost of doing something and ranking those things. And when you go through that process, that's really how you defend when you get down the road to putting an application together, how you're going to defend where you spent your limited dollars and how you decided to do it. They're going to want to see that you went through these things. But again, like I said, I think that's something that folks should be doing anyways. This is a good way to kind of drag the fine-tooth comb through the whole process. Now, I'm going to throw it over to David here in a second. The cost benefit analysis, if you're a venue without any perimeter hardening, there's tons of things you can do. You can harden columns, retrofit hardened columns. If you're a brand new venue, you can think about where to place your columns. You can glaze glass. You can do a lot of facade mullion hardening, and there's tons of things that seating bowl tie down so the seats. Seats weren't really built for uplift. They're built to be pushed down. So maybe you tie down your seats. You could do a whole range of things, tie down your roofs and enhance the trusses. But one of the most basic things, and I think the cost benefit analysis typically always shows, is the thing that you should start with is a hardened perimeter, a crash rated perimeter. And so I'm going to hand it over to David to talk a little bit about that, because that's one of the most critical pieces, stopping the vehicle from getting close before it can do its bad deed, whether it's trying to ram people or trying to detonate a very large IED close to the venue. David?
Yeah, thanks, Akmal. And to the point that Akmal's talking about, being intentional and having a process at which you go about this analysis, whether you're doing Safety Act or not, these are good principles. These are good basics. Same thing Phil said about the way you evaluate your operation, Safety Act or not, these are important things to do. So I want to do a couple just sort of high level things before we dig into vehicle barrier implementation in a little more detail. And that is to establish a couple things. One, barriers are a tool. They're not the solution. Just like a camera is a tool, it's not the solution. So as a venue or as a facility of any sort, you want to stay focused on the solution. So, okay, so barrier is not the solution. So how do I get the right one? Well, there's a lot of factors that need to be considered in order to do that. We need to consider the life cycle cost, and there's a lot of other factors. So there's civil factors, there's operational factors. And so how do we take all these pieces and do something with them if the barrier is not our focus? I tell people, don't fall in love with a barrier. You don't want to fall in love with a shovel and get to the solution you need to do, and you need a backhoe. That doesn't work very well. Same sort of thing here. So let's talk about in more detail now the process. Akmal talked about the threats. So if you've had an assessment done by a third-party firm, and you've got your vulnerability assessments and your threat assessments, your vectors and stuff are done, those come into this part of the process, specific process related to barriers, as inputs. If you did not have that done, you need to have it done in some fashion, because we need the threat and the vulnerabilities to, they dictate some of the criteria that we need as we go through this process. What is the rating? What are the penetrations that might be needed? Bill can speak to the fact that you can get this vector analysis and it's all great and wonderful, and it says you need this rating everywhere, but it doesn't necessarily consider, where are my assets? What kind of penetration do I need? Am I really getting a direct hit or a glancing blow? So all those threat related items come into this as part of the process. Then we have to look at the civil conditions. We need to do utility locates. In some cases, we need to do ground penetrating radar. Particularly if we think there's something under there, we have concerns about what's underground and the locations that the barriers are going. That, along with the utility locates, start to frame another set of conditions that have to be accounted for. Then there's the operational considerations. Is this an access control point? How are you processing vehicles? What's going on through there? How fast do they need to be processed? And then we need stakeholder input. Stakeholder input is critical. Phil talked about management buy-in, getting everybody's view of this, because you can have this great plan and someone, if you miss a stakeholder, is going to come and go, I don't like the way that looks. So, if you haven't gotten all of those factors, then you could create a problem later. So the assessment phase is a data collection of all the inputs. Then we get into the engineering phase. And this is where we head toward barrier selection. So we take the threats, we take all those things from the assessment, the rating, and so forth. And now we look at the civil conditions that we had. What depth can we go? Our ground penetrating radar and our utility locates tell us, okay, we only have 3 feet we can work with. All right, that eliminates some deep mount barriers that can't be used. We have layout as another example. So we need to cover a certain width of roadway. Well, product A might take 2 of them, product B might take 3 of them, product C might be overkill. So we need to look at what products will fit and solve our problem. Again, we're trying to get the solution taken care of. Another example is drainage. What's the crown in the road? Where are we going to take the water to? We go into a sump pump? We go into a sewer? Where is that located? Is it in the front, the back, the left, or the right? And where do we need to drain? All barriers don't drain from the same place. So if we have to drain from the back, then barriers who don't allow you the drainage from the back are now not an option. So as this process goes on, I call this natural deselection. So I said at the beginning, don't fall in love with a barrier, because your barrier that you fell in love with may get naturally deselected in this process. Bill's grinning because he knows this. And so as we walk through this systematically, remember the barrier is a tool. We're still in the process as we take the information from the assessment and we look at layout, we look at drainage, and we look at the other things. We're still designing and developing the solution. So another factor that has to take place in this is the theory of operation and how the controls work. So this gets into things like, how are you processing vehicles? What are your credentialing factors? Who's allowed in and who's not? Do you need a daytime mode, nighttime mode, weekend mode? How many different if-then scenarios will happen with you as you're processing vehicles? And as you go through all of that, and now you've determined through that I need safety loops and I need vehicle detection at this point. Now you're in a position that you can select a barrier. When you follow this process, and back to one of Akmal's points about being able to document the DHS, we didn't do everything, but we thought about everything. And we've got a reason why we did what we did. This process allows you to justify the barrier that you ultimately selected and the reasons why. So you may end up at this point, there may only be one barrier that will actually perform the solution that you've designed in this process. Maybe you have 2 choices, maybe there's more than that. But so it's really important that you follow these processes. And then we get to construction. We're going to come back to that in just a minute. I want to take a segue, if I could, just really briefly, so that we don't lose big picture. I'm sure all of you have seen these security triangles. And I want to make sure that as you go through these processes, you don't lose sight of the security principles. We have people, procedures, and equipment, and they perform detection, delay, and response. So just a couple quick examples for each of these. As it relates to people and your barriers, training and retraining is critical. Guards turnover, people turnover, things change. Phil talked about the changing environment at a stadium. That may mean you process vehicles different, so you need to train and retrain to make sure that the people can function in the way that you want them to. And the controls and the layout of the controls are important so that you've got an accurate depiction of what you want that guard to do. One example from our experience is we looked at a project that had a guard booth and controls on that guard booth to operate barriers, and they had it all oriented so that the barriers were behind the guard. So we couldn't see what he was doing. So again, factoring in the people and where are they and what are they doing is critical in this process. The procedures take into account those things we talked about, the theory of operation, operational protocols, and we need to make sure that those procedures are accomplishing the things that you want to accomplish from a security perspective. And then the equipment obviously is the tools that help the people operate the procedures. And that consists of the barrier, the controls, and whatever optional things go with those barriers. So I just wanted to step sideways just for a minute and make sure we didn't lose perspective of the big picture. The last thing I want to talk about is construction administration. This is important for DHS, and Akmal can attest to the fact that they care how you implement. And is there a process by which you implement? Is there good documentation about how you're implemented these solutions that you've put together? So let me just stress for a moment, communication. Regular reporting while the process is going on is important. And that includes good documentation of submittals and as-builts. If this communication and this reporting is done regularly and effectively, now change management is much easier. Also, issue resolution is easier. And let me just tell you, you guys know this. This is a construction project. When you put in vehicle barriers, it's a construction project. And when you have a construction project, you find things. Stuff happens. You can do utility locates and you can do ground penetrating radar, and you can still find things that didn't show up in any of those. And occasionally you get some battle scars from those if you're not prepared. But if you have good communication and good documentation, now you're able to address those issues timely, effectively, and take care of the customer along the way and involve them in a good solution to that issue. Obviously, we need superb and very good quality control and adherence to the manufacturer requirements. There can be no shortcuts when it comes to compliance and the way that the barriers are installed. And then testing. And I want to stop here for just a couple extra minutes. Really good testing is important so that you know that that theory of operation will work and practically will work. So think back to we talked about the theory of operation. Let's assume for a minute that we've got a daytime mode, different operational mode at night, and a different one on the weekend. And in each of those modes, there are 4 to 8 scenarios that you've designed in your theory of operation. If a vehicle comes with this scenario and does this, this is the way we want the system to operate. So you take 4 or 5 of those for 3 different modes, that's 15, 18, 20 different scenarios. A good performance verification test, PVT, will test every one of those to make sure that they operates exactly how the security director, Phil, wants it to operate, exactly how the theory of operation has been designed to facilitate that. So please do not shortcut testing. Make sure every aspect of your program and your solution has been tested. And I've said this a couple times, I'm just gonna say it one more time, training is critical. Things change, operations change. Training may involve a couple of different scenarios. In a venue like the Cardinals, not only do they play baseball there, they have concerts and other rallies and things that go on there, and there may be different protocols. So the training is very, very important. So my last just overall point is follow a good process so that you can document, you can make sure that you've achieved the solution in the way that you wanted it. And so that's the way it should work. I'm going to throw it back to Phil, who's got plenty of lessons learned. I'm sure he'll share a few of those about how he did that as he went through his process. Thanks, Phil.
So, one of the things, the relationship you have with the people you're working with has to be symbiotic. And so, you're going to feed off of each other on ideas and feedback and things like that. One of the things that Akmal had mentioned earlier, as far as the assessments and things like that, I actually figured out ways to, instead of having a private third party do it, I figured out ways to get the government to come in and do it for me for nothing. So I had, if you're a large venue and you're doing concerts, sports, whatever, and you're next to high-rise buildings, have you done a high-rise risk assessment, and who's doing that? I actually was able to bring in the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency and do a LiDAR study of downtown St. Louis and figure out, okay, which buildings were a direct threat to me? How could they see? What were their views? What was our view of them? What could they see? What areas were susceptible and vulnerable within the stadium? with our blast analysis. You know, instead of having DHS go, okay, which was the firm that did this, I'm bringing DHS in to do the blast analysis and update it. And you can either use DHS themselves or Defense Threat Reduction, but DTRA, for those that are familiar. But you know, just different things out there to help you all out, because I think one of the things that we're all going through at this time, especially in these COVID times, is that without guests, you know, we're kind of limited as far as our budgets, and most of us right now can't afford to pay attention, let alone pay for consultants and all this other stuff. So it's really important that we do this smartly and figure out other ways, because the threats aren't going away, but we still have to operate. So we got to figure out, get creative on those kinds of things. As far as the biggest challenges, I think, you know, that we're going to see is be prepared. I tell this to everybody, semper gumby, always be flexible. Things are going to change. Be prepared for that. Don't be stuck. As David said a couple of times, don't be stuck on a product. Be stuck on the goal and what the solution is. What is your ultimate goal? If your ultimate goal is to protect your venue from a vehicle ramming, from creating a 100-foot buffer, depending on your blast analysis, things that, okay, get to those goals. You may have, there may be a solution that you went, that's what I want to do. Might be in the end, when you start looking at everything, that's exactly what you can't use. So be more fixated on your goal as far as where it is you want to go to, what it is you want to do. You know, David alluded to something really important as far as the training and making sure that you're buying the products you have aren't exceeding the capabilities of the people that you're going to have utilizing them. You know, that it's really important that what you're buying, the tools that you're buying, can be fully exploited. So if you're buying some new whiz bang shiny penny and you're only able to exploit 20-30% of that product, and 70% you can't even use because your people don't know how to use it, or you don't have the need for it, but it was the neat thing to get, it was that product you really wanted, you're wasting, you know, it's a waste of money. You can always point at, well, we got this great new thing here, but you've wasted your assets, and you haven't prioritized what it is your end goal is well. So that prioritization is really important. We have so our perimeter hardening was over 3 years. And we did that based on which were the greatest threats, which were we going to get, and pardon the pun, but the best bang for the buck on protecting the stadium, and which were the greatest vulnerabilities that we had to deal with right now, and which were the threats that were, if they occurred or if that thing happened, the impact would be less than this other place. So that's kind of how we allocated, because there's no way you're going to have all the funds right up front. I'll just put it to you right now. Vehicle hardening, bollards, barriers, all of that stuff is expensive. So you have to be realistic about that and know, hey, look, this is how I'm going to have to do this. But as long as you outline and have your plan, DHS wants to see, okay, well, what is your plan based on all of these assessments and surveys? Let's see what your plan is. And then every year going back, they're going to want to see, okay, have you followed through on your plan? Okay, if you get designation, they're going to want to see, have you followed through? Tell us what you've done. Tell us how you've improved. Show us this continuous process that you explained to us in your application for designation that is going to substantiate you later submitting for certification. Because those were definitely the things we had to do in making sure that we were meeting the model that DHS wanted us to follow. So, the outline is there, and a lot of what you'll be able to utilize. Major League Baseball, we're very lucky in Major League Baseball, because at Major League Baseball, they have a fundamental set of overarching guidelines from a security perspective that they want you to follow. That's a real good roadmap as a starting point. Now, is every stadium going to be different? Sure, because what affects me from a risk perspective isn't going to necessarily affect somebody else. So while Major League Baseball's risk assessment may have hurricanes on there, I'm in St. Louis. Hurricanes don't impact me. So I don't even address hurricanes, even though they want me to, but that's a whole other story and we're not going to get into it. But which is kind of a funny inside joke. But the it's important to focus your assets, your priorities, your work, your time, everything on things that are directly impacting you, realistic threats, things of that nature. So, it's really important, I think, to make sure that your priorities set, that you have a plan. If anybody here is military, I know they've heard this saying, and if you fail to plan, then you're planned to fail. So that plan is going to be critical to what it is your goals are and where you're trying to get to. And then make sure that as far as the barrier, don't be set on a barrier. As I said, as David has said, make sure you're focused on your solution as opposed to that. Okay. I think go ahead and want to wrap it up there, Akmal.
Yeah, we're going to take questions here in a moment. Yes, sir. But as a wrap up, as a kind of a conclusion of our 3 sets of comments here, I think the underlying theme is document and just and then, a phrase that's used in the sports world, famous by the Philadelphia 76ers, trust the process. This is the process that you see here. Just trust it. Let it take you where it's going to take you. And again, I want to be just so upfront with this. DHS doesn't think you're going to, you got millions and millions and millions and millions to spend on this stuff. You're going to warrant Safety Act, you are going to have to do some things. There's no doubt about it. The Safety Act process, Phil knows it requires some soul searching moments. You're going to, if those of you who are in the process or have gone through it yourselves, you know what I'm talking about. Those who are thinking about the Safety Act, I never ever like to undersell or oversell the process. It's a thorough, it's rigorous, but I think it's fair. Identify understand your threats, understand the vulnerabilities you have to those threats, rank your risks, come up with a list of good enhancement design options, conduct a cost benefit analysis that not only might defend why you decide to push some projects out to year 2 or year 3, as Phil mentioned, but some of those, the conclusion of some of these cost benefit analysis might defend why you never do something. I'm not going to ever do X. It was an option. Here's why we're not going to do it. We've got to be smart. But as Phil said, I love his point about the out-year planning. If you're going in for designation and you don't have the whole thing figured out yet, they want to know what your out-year planning. Year 2 is this. Year 3 is that, and they're okay with it. You'd be surprised, but they're human. They get it. They got a budget to run their own office. They get that. You just have to step up to the plate on committing to the enhancement. Excuse the pun there. Secure the right effective partners, and then finally, really have a really strong QA process. David mentioned that. I really applaud his comments. Can't stress it enough. Like I said, on the modeling side, they're going to really try to rerun your numbers. They're going to see what you came up with. On the construction side, okay, everything looks beautiful. You got the right barrier, you got the right design. How do I know the thing that's in the ground is actually what you designed? And so they want to see your QA stuff. And so I think that was a really big component of Phil and the Cardinals application that they really loved. And so, that's kind of what we wanted to do, is express the process through the lens of the Safety Act. We think, I think all 3 of us, speaking for Phil and David, that we think this is a process you should follow anyways, regardless of Safety Act. Yes. One foot in front of the other. So I think we'll toss up for questions. Michael?
Yeah, I want to remind everybody that for questions, if you have some questions, if you look on the right-hand side, you'll see a drop-down menu. Please post your questions in that. For mobile phone users, your menu is at the bottom of the screen. So the first question is, first one part is to the panel, and then Phil, I think this is probably directed at you, but what does the panel assess as the threat level of terror, considering much of the country is focused on COVID-19? And the follow-up, what are we doing at venues to keep focus on these threats?
So it's kind of like, wait, squirrel. Yeah, no, you can't. You're always focused on one thing, and you got to be able to multitask in this job. I mean, it's there's always going to be new things. I always tell people, this being in security there isn't a time period where you go, well, I'm going to put my feet up. Everything's done. I got it all set. I can relax now. I don't have to do anything. I can just coast for the next couple of years and worry about drunks. No, threats change, situations change. COVID has changed our operations. COVID has impacted our budgets, what we're doing, has affected our staffing, the people we have in the state. I mean, everything. So, but how do you still manage those things in that new environment? So you don't lose sight of that other thing. This is just another variable that emphasizes that semper gumby mindset of flexibility and just, okay, I still have to worry about this, but how do I worry about this and still manage this other, curveball that I'm being thrown, to use a baseball analogy? I mean, that's the whole thing. And I think that's the critical part of it. COVID, and we were impacted pretty significantly by COVID during, early on in the season. I think we played seven games or something like that. And we had 17 people come back positive on one road trip within a matter of 3 days. And then, we all got locked down in a hotel in Milwaukee as a result. So, so we know those impacts quite significantly. And it's a matter of being able to operate within the environment and still keep an eye on the threats, because even though we didn't have guests, there's been social unrest going on and protests and everything else. And so that was happening in St. Louis actively while we were playing games, even though we didn't have guests. That stuff was happening outside the stadium. So, I'm making sure that you still have the staffing, you're still doing the protective things, still blocking the roads that I want to block, that continue to do those things. So nothing, if you're just completely distracted by one thing and forget the other, then you're making a mistake. You've still got to do those fundamental things.
The one thing I would just add, I totally agree, Phil. And the one thing I would just underscore is that, by design, these bad actors, this is their MO. You wait until things start, the pressure's off of you, and then you do, the day before the Ariana Grande concert attack in Manchester, UK. I mean, the day before, no one was talking about it, right? That's right. We all woke up, I think, to the news about the very horrific stabbing incident in Paris and out in France this morning, where someone decided to attack. I mean, that's its very nature. I think the other quick thing I'd make a real quick point on is the fact that this isn't just for terrorism. A lot of the things that you do for counterterrorism actually have a tangential benefit to other things. God forbid someone falls asleep at the wheel, someone loses control of their car by chance, and there's a complete accident. Well, you got the barrier system there to do more than just stop a bad person too. But I like your comments, Phil. I applaud that.
Okay, another question for Phil. They talked about the best way to pursue a safety act is to have one person in charge. Is this that person's full-time job, or is it among many jobs that they have?
Good luck with that. Good luck at a sports venue being able to hire one person within your organization just to do safety act. No, I think we're all multitaskers, and it's a lot of late nights. It's a lot of hard work. If it was easy, everybody would get it. Everybody would do it. But it's I can tell you that from the time when I got initially hired to the time when I submitted my packet, so that was January to July, that time period, I took over as the point person sometime around March, I'd say, because we were doing this by a committee at that time, and it just wasn't working. We had been kind of dragging for almost a year in this process and really not getting anywhere. And I kind of went, and my background, I don't know if it's out there, but I'm a retired Army Green Beret and kind of a little bit on the crazy side, type A, kind of let's go get this done type of person. And so,
Are you sure?
I'm pretty sure. That's my wife. It's really important to get to that point where you go, okay, I've got to take care of this. I got to make this happen. and you just start taking things on and bringing people along with you within your organization. And believe me, the people within your organization will be glad to give it to you and let you be the point person for it. But it'll also facilitate much better communication, I think, between whoever's is facilitating your Safety Act proposal and DHS. I think that communication will make it a lot easier, because whoever's helping you, if you have a consultant doing it, they only have one person to contact. They don't have to reach out to 5, 10 different people, because that's the kind of buy-in and that's the kind of depth and width of impact it affects your organization. So it's going to affect your finance people, your HR people, your IT people, your facilities people, your maintenance, everybody's involved. And then, oh yeah, there's the security, the police, the medics, the cops, everybody, all of that as well. So everybody's a part of this. There isn't an entity within your stadium that's really left out. And then you've got baseball or your team operations, things of that, because how do you secure the team when they're traveling and other teams coming in? All of those things come into play.
Yeah, and if I may just speak to it from the other side, as someone who had the great fortune of working with the Cardinals and Phil and with other organizations, like, the Safety Act process isn't just you come in, you ask for a bunch of documents, and you write an application. There's a lot of growth going on. And I always like to say, like, to create a family atmosphere from the get-go, because there's going to be some soul searching and evaluating processes. And so from my role, working with the organization, you're going to be asking a lot of people to reflect and, evaluate some of the internal processes. But then it becomes kind of dispersed. And, working with Phil, we're able to kind of just go, okay, and this department, we talked about doing these things. Phil, how's that coming along? We all agree that Y is a good path. Everyone's on board, but has Y happened? And that sometimes becomes a pitfall for folks as they're going through the process. They ask, hey, this is taking longer than I thought. And sometimes it's just kind of the grueling part of it, of just change management, really.
Yeah, if you're in an organization that is very comfortable with, well, this is the way we've always done it, get used to that going away, because that has to go away in this process. Has to.
Okay. I want to remind everybody that at the top of the hour, I know some of you have to leave. As long as the questions come in, we're going to continue to go. I want to remind everyone that this session is being recorded and that you can access this recording at the NCS4 website. So the next question, and David, I believe this is probably addressed to you. There was some confusion about drainage. They didn't know exactly what needed to be drained. Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. The process that I talked about was the worst case scenario, or the most difficult, as operable barriers. If you have a fixed or a manual, some of those things we talked about wouldn't apply. But barriers that are in the ground that operate can take on water, and the worst enemy of a barrier is water. So something that gets overlooked, and it's a critical part of the design process, is to take that water and get it out of the barrier and move it away. And so the drainage capability of a barrier impacts whether it can be used in your particular location based on how and where you're going to take that water.
Yep.
Okay. Phil, back to you. Phil spoke about using a LiDAR test in regards to high-rise risk, but is there any views on using LiDAR to get to-scale models of venues to use for command and control during an incident?
Absolutely. I totally agree. You can utilize it any way you want. It's I had them also do, they also did video and full, they did a full model of my stadium, not just for LiDAR, but video of every corridor, walkway. So I utilized it for emergency exits, demonstrating pathways in the event one area is blocked. This is how you go. So yeah, I definitely, absolutely. There's multiple uses for it.
Okay. And Amal, maybe you can give some insight on this one. The question is, how is DHS approving application in regards to stadiums that haven't had fans in 2020?
Oh, great question. Great question. If you are a new applicant, in other words, you haven't engaged DHS at all, you've got something going in your favor. DHS for the last several years has been really encouraging large venues to submit pre-applications first. The pre-application allows you to get on the record with DHS, get the dance going, let them learn about you, and you get to let them explain to them how your program. But it doesn't start the official clock. So in fact, what I would encourage everybody that if you're on the cusp of going after it, don't let the delay of the 2020 season worry you. You can submit a pre-app. You're still going to explain who you are. You'll still explain all your policies and procedures. Hopefully you've done a hardened perimeter or you're in the process of it. So you've just explained how you're doing the things that we talked about today. You get the application over to them. It allows them to spend government resources when it's submitted as a pre-app to roll up their sleeves and do some of the hard analytic work up front. And then, we'll all see as a group here what happens in 2021. Hopefully we get back to full normalcy or as close to it as possible. And that will just help you gather the documentation you need to submit a full application after that.
Okay, we're going to stick with you. Regarding the Safety Act, what is one of the major pitfalls for applicants when they reach the final DHS application?
Yeah, it's going to be a boring answer, but it is the answer, and that's documentation. If you go through this process that we laid out today and you spent all the money and you got the best people and everything, none of it exists or none of it matters if you can't document it. And so it's even documenting the mundane stuff. I had them, let's just say, take this group. Phil, David, and I had a meeting about X, Y, and Z side of the stadium, and let's document it. Where's the agenda? Get your meeting notes, make sure that there's a sign-in sheet. When you have those types of meetings between engineers and the stadium ops and the engineering folks, even things down to that level are worth it. And of course, the more serious big stuff is, construction QA, design drawings, your TVRA, the blast analysis, the vehicle vector analysis. Those are the obvious ones. Those are generally reports. But it's the thing that falls through the cracks, the meetings, the cost benefit analysis conclusions, the after action reports. Those are the things that if you've got it documented, and I should say, it doesn't have to be perfect, folks. Those who've been through Safety Act know. And Phil, you actually made a great point earlier, which is discover the ugly stuff and put a plan together to make it good. In fact, DHS tells you, and I know I work there, if you come in with a perfect application where it shows no blemishes, they kick you out. They say, okay, when you're ready to be open, come back in. And if they're okay with it. They're okay with it. They're evaluating not only how good you are, but also how effective you are, I should say, but they're also evaluating how good are you or effective are you at finding when you're not doing good and then correcting and rectifying it. So it's fair that way, I think. So that documentation.
Yeah, I would also add to that documentation that make sure what you put on paper you're really doing. This is not a paper drill.
That's
a lot of people think, well, if I just put this on paper, it's going to be good. Well, let me tell you what, having a policy, I have 28 different policies. Well, if my policies, the only person that knows them is me, and they sit on a shelf. And when DHS comes in, I go, here's my policies. And nobody else around me knows them. They're not policies. That's my hidden agenda. It's not a policy that everybody's part of, or that everybody knows, or that everybody's trained on. So you might as well not have a policy if that's the kind of policy you have. So this is not a paper drill. This is a realistic, what you have on paper, you better be doing, because when DHS comes in, they already have gone through your policies and they want to see that you're doing what it is you have in black and white.
Yeah, to Phil's point,
that's critical.
Yeah, excuse me, Phil, sorry.
No,
that's a great point. Those who haven't been through the process, when you submit an application, at some point, and it's a venue-related application, at some point DHS will want to come do a site visit. And that's not an audit, it's not an inspection, they're not going to be climbing through your HVAC ducts, but they will be very versed in what they read in your application. And if they'll walk around, they've gotten good at this, after so many years, they'll know when someone's bluffing. And so that's, you don't want to do that, of course. I don't think anybody would want to do that out there either, but that's a great point, Phil.
Okay, we've got a series of law enforcement questions, and Phil, you might be the best to answer these. The first one is, what is the relationship and intelligence sharing with the local police in relation to stadium events?
So depending on what kind of events, so preseason and midseason, I do a standardized risk assessment, and I bring in the local JTTF, St. Louis Intelligence Center, St. Louis City Police, St. Louis County Police, FBI, DHS, St. Louis Emergency Management, fire. I bring in all the commander of my secondary police detail. I bring in all of our partners. Plus, I also bring in my business neighbors that are around the stadium, so that we can kind of take a more neighborhood approach to our security posture, as opposed to security just ends at where my sidewalks end. So this way, it's a much more holistic approach to our security. And I think that's worked out really well, especially in downtown St. Louis. So that information sharing happens all the time. I mean, not just those standardized things. Plus, if we're going to have like a concert or postseason, or a special event where we're doing a marathon, or our Spartan run. I mean, we do all kinds of things here at the stadium. I'm going to do a special risk assessment particular to that event, looking at what's going on at that time in that time period prior to that event. Do we have any social unrest? Do we have any particular threats, weather? And it runs the gambit of our entire risk assessment. So, and bringing in all those parties and making sure that we're doing the training that we need to do annually. Are we doing our tabletops? Have we gone through talking through active shooter scenarios? Has there been anything recently? Have we been paying attention to what's gone on in the world to see new trends, things like that? Is there any new I mean, I've been very much in contact with JTTF and the local police department pertaining to any new things pertaining to possible protests and things pertaining to the election, things like that. Because even though I don't have guests here, I don't have baseball, I still have a stadium and people here that I have to protect. So, so it's not just when there's an event or something like that. So that's, I think, really critical to keep in mind.
Are those relationships with the local law enforcement agencies, is there MOUs, or is it more of a casual relationship?
So it depends. So I have MOUs as far as having police here and bringing certain elements here, because I have certain special arrangements with certain groups that provide SWAT support, and certain groups that provide my regular police secondary, and then I have another agreement for canine. So it's just how you do it. And I'm a little bit different than a lot of other folks in that I actually have a private contract company utilize SWAT trained officers to come in here and provide quick response teams to the stadium and that's for every game, every concert, anything and everything. And so they provide, if necessary, sniper protection, quick response, SWAT team type response for an active shooter, for, it's those things you hope never happen. So
it's a perfect segue to my next question. Akmal, maybe you can answer this one. Is the utilization of a local SWAT team, particularly their Overwatch or counter sniper teams, and their response teams, and maybe their utilization of large caliber weapons, does that affect can it enhance someone's safety application, the fact that they utilize resources like that?
Yes, absolutely. And sorry, I want to talk on that first, Phil, or you want me to tackle it?
No, I'll just answer that really quickly, and then you can tag on. I think that absolutely anything you can do is going to enhance your application. Anything you do that's kind of outside the box, anything you do that is going to make you safer, better. Even if it's something, it's not something that you have to do, but it's something you do because it's particular to your area. Because I've got high-rise buildings all around my stadium. I've got hotels, I've got, office buildings. I've got a new condo right across the street. Positioning, depending on what the event is and things like that, positioning people, or, looking at new protections from drones and things like that is something I'm doing all the time.
Yeah, I just second that, Phil. I mean, I think DHS wants to see, just like the perimeter hardening that we're talking about, David, earlier. DHS wants to see there's a storyline that got you to your conclusion. But ultimately, having SWAT counter sniper teams for sure enhances an application. But it's to Phil's point, because you actually need it. Why do you need it? Well, as we know, and it's happening in St. Louis, and it's happening at a lot of awesome stadiums and arenas. We're building entertainment hubs next to these stadiums. People are already coming down there for the fun of the game. Why not have dinner beforehand or afterwards, or a cocktail or some other family centric events? So it's becoming these entertainment hubs, and DHS, loves that. I think that's cool. But the question is, okay, now you've got sniper vantage point. So what are you going to do about that? So some folks say, look, I've got a really good relationship with the venue across the street. We're requiring them to do magnetometer screening, and we're going to shut down all of their balconies. In other places, they may have counter sniper teams. There's not. I would say this. I would caveat with not every. I know this from working with so many of you venue operators across the U.S. No two cities funded the same, and not everybody's going to be able to get access to their local law enforcement counter sniper teams or SWAT teams. But if you are able to, especially in the sniper teams, and you have a sniper threat, huge way to address that issue. Tactical teams, I think, are becoming more needed everywhere. I mean, just having some quick response tactical teams on opposite sides of the stadium, I think that threat has presented itself, but not everybody's got the sniper issue to worry about. So tactical teams, although they're not available everywhere, I recognize if you have it, it's a great resource to have. Something DHS will definitely make note of.
And that's kind of why I mentioned earlier, that's going to depend, I mean, on everything that you're doing, all the different assets you're putting in place. Where is your stadium? Is it in a rural area? Is it in an urban area? Are there tall buildings? Are there none? Do you have a wide open space, and the closest building is 2,000 feet away and it doesn't have any kind of a view into your stadium? I mean, these are all critical things to think about, prior to your planning, because you're not going to employ snipers if you don't need to. So I mean, having the quick response, I think, is a necessary thing. But I've gotten calls from teams. Well, baseball says that we should have radiological detection and chemical detection type of stuff here and everywhere in every mailroom. Well, if there's really no threat for it, and we haven't seen something there that really demands that, or there is no active threat for that in your area, or what the cost of that is huge. It's going to take away assets for more pertinent or more realistic threats that are actually more in play. So you want to be allocating your assets really smartly, and that's why that prioritization that we referred to in the presentation is so important.
Okay, and again, I want to remind everybody, if you have a question, please ask it. Use for desktop users and PC users, the menu is on the right-hand side. For mobile phone users, the menu is at the bottom. So this one from one of our international listeners: how does the USA DHS Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency vehicle mitigation guidance complement or liaise with other international protective security advisory agencies, such as the UK Center Protection National Infrastructure?
That's a great question. And I would say that if you would compare the two best practices in the literature in both countries, I think you'll find that they're pretty well aligned. I think they do a good job of sharing those. Of course, it starts with just can we agree on some crash rating standards? And so, what used to be the State Department, K-rated system, and now we're moving over to an ASTM M30, M40, M50 rating. What I've found, and Phil, and David, please let me know what you guys see. But I think I've seen the two sides trying to work on establishing similar guidance across the pond, as they say.
And I'll tell you, having gone through a preparatory process, because prior to the COVID thing, we were going to be playing against the Chicago Cubs in London last year. So I did all of my homework and communicated with my UK partners and everything else on what they had in place in and around the stadium, what the threats were, all of that stuff. So that partnership was really great, and the language, from one system to the other was really pretty interactive and pretty consistent. So I didn't really see a whole lot of difference in the application.
And I would just say about the barrier testing, they are fairly closely aligned, but it sort of goes back to the process that we talked about. What's the threat? What do you really need? The little differences in some of the testing, the vehicle size or angle of impact, or those things, may be valid for your particular situation, and a standard from somewhere else might actually be most appropriate to your situation. So if you follow the process, then you sort of sort through those, and you can arrive at the right decision. But they are pretty similar. There's not a lot of difference.
Okay, we've got one final question. If we did not get to your question, we'll send this to the panel, and we'll send you an answer later on. And again, I want to remind everybody this session is being recorded, and you can access this through our website. So David, this is directed towards you. Can you speak on how a perimeter security integrator like yourself works with someone like Phil to ensure the final integrated solution achieves the security mission?
It's following the process. And a big part of that is in that assessment phase. Once we've collected the data, is that stakeholder input. And that makes sure that Phil and his whole team have input into the barrier piece. And you know, we're talking about barriers today, but this goes the same scenario with Phil looking at his camera system and other systems within his whole program. Is you get all the stakeholders together, and then what we bring as the integrator is we bring the toolbox. We talked about focus on the solution. Once you get the solution defined, some tools fall out of the tool belt and they're not applicable anymore. And so that's how you achieve, you follow the process, and ultimately you achieve the solution, and then you test it and you make sure that it'll actually do what Phil wants it to do.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, you know, one thing that I've always appreciated is knowing, you know, I referenced bad news earlier, so, and being flexible and being ready for change. You know, what you thought you were going to do with this project or these barriers may change mid-process, and having whoever you're working with come over to you and go, hey, we're not going to be able to do this. Here's why, but here's what we can do. And we may have to use a different type of thing. Be ready for those kinds of discussions. And if you don't have somebody that's willing to say that to you, and they're going to do something that really isn't going to help you in the long run, you may need to find somebody different. And I cannot stress that enough. I mean, ultimately, it's your facility. You want the best outcome that you can have, but understand there may be limitations where this is the only option. It may not be what you wanted, but it's going to be the best option you have. So, you know, it's unfortunate, but that's, as long as it gets you to that goal, keep in mind, don't lose sight of the goal, and as opposed to being fixated on the product. So,
and you have to, it's open communication. You know, it's pushback. You know, there's pushback in both directions and challenging of thinking. And that's how, sort of back to Akmal's process with DHS. And so you got to think through and you got to change. And so that open dialogue and a willingness to challenge, you know, whether it's the integrator challenging the client or vice versa, or challenging the operational procedures, that open communication, being willing to do that is ultimately how you get to the end goal, and having a solid process. Akmal said it, trust the process.
Yeah, because your process might change as a result of the new structure. And if that has to happen, then so be it. Then that's what you got to do, because you don't have any other option.
Okay, I think that's going to be it for the questions that we didn't get to. We will send them to the panel, and we'll send you through email. We'll send you the answers to them. I want to thank our panelists, David, Phil, and Akmal, for a fantastic presentation, and I want to thank our viewers out there for joining us. And on behalf of NCS4 and the University of Southern Mississippi, we want to thank you for being with us today. A reminder that you can access this recording of this session at our website. It's ncs4.usm.edu. So thank you very much, and look forward to seeing you next time.